Silver Gray, the Gray Fog. Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague, but I regret I must take issue with the premise of his question insofar as, he would bore you to death. No anger, no fire, just a fog machine, fog into which you could walk and you could never be seen again. But there was something lawyerly about it, I guess, and even though it was low energy, it wasn't just duck speak, as Orwell would say. It wasn't just babbling. It was a bureaucratic answer, but it was an answer, I guess. But the past is a different country, isn't it? What a world we're in now. Did you see the UK Prime Minister, K'7rRmzJaHLL, at the big gathering at the White House last week for Vladimir Zelensky? Trump and the seven dwarfs, I call it, each of the European leaders, trying to appear so important when everyone knew the only decider in the room was Trump himself. But they had all flown over all the way to America, so they were given about 2 minutes each to say their piece. Do you remember K'7rRmzJaHLL, it's a British PM? Remember his comments? Just listen to this and tell me if you understood any of it, or if it was duck speak, not her great bureaucratic speak, but just blah, 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 blah. Do you understand what any of this means?
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for hosting us here. Can I start where Emmanuel started, which is we all want peace. The war in Ukraine has had a huge impact, particularly on the Ukrainians who bore the brunt of it, but it's also had an impact on Europe and on the United Kingdom as another family or community that hasn't been affected. And when we talk about security, we're talking about the security not just of Ukraine, we're talking about the security of Europe and the United Kingdom as well, which is why this is such an important issue. I think this is such an important meeting. As a group, I think we've had a discussion on the phone a couple of times, Mr. President, to be able now to be around the table, to take it forward. And I really feel that we can, I think, with the right approach this afternoon, make real progress, particularly on security guarantees, and your interpretation of security guarantees, and some sort of Article 5 style guarantees, fits with what we've been doing in the Coalition of Willing, which we started some months ago, bringing countries together and showing that we were prepared to step up to the plate when it came to security, with you coming alongside, US alongside, what we've already developed. I think we could take a really important step forward today, historic step actually, to come out of this meeting in terms of security for Ukraine, security in Europe. I also feel that we can make real progress towards a just and lasting outcome. Obviously that has to involve Ukraine, and a trilateral meeting to sensible next step. So thank you for being prepared to take that forward, because I think if we can ensure that that is the progress out of this meeting, those security guarantees and some sort of progress on trilateral meeting of some sort to bring some of the difficult issues to a head, then I think today will be seen as a very important day in recent years. In relation to a conflict which has gone on for 3 and a bit years, and so far nobody's been able to bring it to this point, so I thank you for that.
The only part I understood was K'7rRmzJaHLL believes that every single family in the United Kingdom has had their lives changed by the war in Ukraine. I'm just not sure that's true. And Trump gave a funny look right at that moment to J.D. Vance, who was standing in the room when Starmer said that. But Starmer is one of those modern robotic duck speakers who say nothing, and after a while you realize it, and then you can't unhear it, and you begin to despise even the sound of his voice. If you don't follow UK politics, you won't know what I mean about Starmer, but it's basically the bizarre style of speaking that Chrystia Freeland has perfected.
We have a very impressive deficit of some $60 billion in the last budget. So when do you foresee a return to a balanced budget? Ms. Freeland speaks first.
Mr. Jobin, we are all liberals, and we will not repeat Conservative misinformation. We are not going to do the Conservatives' work for them. The reality is that Canada's financial record is very strong. We have a AAA credit rating. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the entire G7. But speaking of our economy, we have to begin with the fact that we're living in a completely different world. Let's begin with the threat that Donald Trump poses. And as Karina suggested, we have to seize the opportunity of this wave of Canadian enthusiasm to build, to attract investment and jobs.
Just so irritating, usually starting with a secret thank you for your question, and then giving a rambling response that is completely unconnected to the answer, that just burns up the time, talks out the clock, and after you hear it a half dozen times, you realize it's not an answer at all, but it's actually a kind of insult delivered with a straight face. How dare you ask me about that? I'm going to thank you for it, and then just burn up the clock talking about whatever I want to talk about. Well, Mark Carney and his clones have perfected it too. Just take a look. So Carney was in Europe because, of course, he's a citizen of Europe. He has an Irish and UK passport, so that's his favorite place. He quit Canada to go there for a bigger opportunity, and I'm not sure he's done social climbing there yet. He said he wants Canada to join the European Union. So he's back there, and he thinks that's the place for him to be. Donald Trump is holding our country's private parts in his fists. But instead of dealing with Trump, which is the vast majority of our trade, Carney is over in Europe, pretending that they can in some way replace our access to the largest market in the world that's just across the border, by car and truck and train. 90% of Canadians live within an hour of the United States, but Mark Carney thinks Germany is going to save us. It's so weird. So let's start with a question put to Carney when he was in Germany about selling energy to Europe. Now, the Germans came to Canada a couple of years ago begging for our energy, real energy, natural gas, not solar energy or electric vehicle fake subsidies, green scam energy, but actual natural gas, because that's what they use, and they're buying it right now from Russia. And it's, I'm not just shaming them, but it's undermining them, because they actually, Europe spends more on Russian natural gas and other energy, including oil, than they do to give Ukraine in aid and weapons each year. Let me say that again. On a sheer mathematical basis, if you ask me which side of the war Europe is on, the mathematical answer would be Russia, because if you're measuring strictly on who Europe gives its money to, Europe gives more money to Russia than to Ukraine because of energy. But Justin Trudeau said, no, we're not going to sell you any LNG. There's no business case for it. So Europe wants to change that. Justin Trudeau refused to sell oil and gas, refused to let it even be produced, let alone shipped, let alone sold. 180 degrees opposite of Jean-Pierre and McClellan. But German reporters are more honest than many Canadian reporters, and here's a little exchange.
Prime Minister, just one question about raw materials. Could you please explore a bit more what Canada can realistically actually offer to Germany and Europe, given the fact that ports on the East Coast and also pipelines are still lacking?
Okay. You're welcome to take the second part of that, my question, if you wish. Thanks for the question. Look, there's a huge range of immediate opportunities with respect to critical metals and minerals, and there are medium-term opportunities with respect to all forms of energy, including LNG and hydrogen. And I'll quickly explain how we make those happen. Our government is in the process of unleashing $500 billion of investment in energy infrastructure, port infrastructure, particularly intelligence infrastructure as well, with AI. And a number of those investments, the first of which we will be formally announcing in the next 2 weeks, are with respect to new port infrastructure. And some of the examples in the public domain will include from reinforcing and building on the Port of Montreal, Contrecoeur, a new port effectively in Churchill, Manitoba, which would open up enormous LNG plus other opportunities, and other East Coast ports for those critical metals and minerals. So there is a lot happening. It's the number one focus of this government is to build that infrastructure, and particularly infrastructure that helps us deepen our partnership with our European partners, and particularly Germany.
So yeah, no pipelines. More money for a port in Montreal. Gee.
This week, Trump took a shot at the Western financial system as we know it that could impact Canada, America, and the rest of the world for decades to come. And at the same time, Canada could head down a similarly frightening path. as Canada's most important banker gave a very revealing speech in Mexico City. Now, at first, this might sound complex or like it doesn't impact you, but trust me, this will impact every single person, their money, and their investments. Plus, we'll go over how you can protect yourself even. You might have already heard about how Trump is firing Lisa Cook, one of the members of the committee who makes incredibly important economic decisions for America. Now, Trump has said this firing is a result of mortgage fraud evidence that they've found, and that will play out as time goes on. But the general consensus is that this is more of a political move, giving Trump effective control over the Federal Reserve, allowing him to lower interest rates, which in turn could help the American economy's numbers ahead of midterm elections. This is a far bigger deal than most people believe. Since the 1950s, central banks have made the claim that they are and should be independent of the government. They should be able to do what they do. The government shouldn't have a say. This is something that the current liberal world order views as incredibly important, a foundational rule that is good for the economy. Though there is some reasonable skepticism there, and we'll get to that soon. It's true central banks like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Canada are incredibly important. And you feel the impact of their decisions on your life every single day, even if you don't realize it. And they have a couple of different responsibilities that come to mind. The first one is setting interest rates. They impact interest rates that flow through the economy, impact whether or not you can get a mortgage and how expensive that mortgage will be, among other things. They are also the lender of last resort. In other words, they lend the government money when nobody else will by printing money. We saw
Stop.
COVID, but we also see it during the Great Financial Crisis. Some economists believe that only bad can come from the government taking control over monetary policy, or the policy that impacts the money. They use Turkey as an example, saying that, hey, when other central banks, well, they've tended to want to go for low interest rates to make their economy work better, and as a result, we see incredibly high results in inflation. To make this point even clearer, recently the governor of the Bank of Canada gave a speech in Mexico City at Mexico's central bank, and he made this point. He said, hard choices and uncertainty increase the risk of public disappointment, frustration, and criticism. That's why it's important for central banks to remain independent from the political process. In other words, he's saying, well, sometimes the Bank of Canada or any central bank is going to have to make decisions that are not popular in the eyes of the politicians who are in power, but we need to be independent so we can continue to make those decisions that are best for the economy. But there is a legitimate argument that while this independence may be good for the economy, it isn't actually best for the people. Now, bear with me here. I'm not making the argument that Trump is in the right here. We'll get into why I'm actually afraid of what's going on. But I will make the argument that this idea that independence, that many see as some sort of hallowed or wholly untouchable right, how it's also part of the cause of the biggest issues we face in our time as a country and globally, such as the incredibly unaffordable housing, the cost of living we're dealing with, and how the quality of life for people like you and me, and average people all around the world, has dropped so incredibly noticeably in the past decade. I'll reemphasize, the Bank of Canada said that's why it's important for central banks to remain independent from the political process. But while he says they're independent from the political process, which is true and could prevent them from being influenced by presidents or prime ministers, what is also true is that this means independence from democracy, independence from accountability to what ultimately should be served, which in my opinion is real people. Let me make my point by telling you a story of what, from a high level, went incredibly wrong during the pandemic and the following years. Let's look at it from the perspective of one central bank, the Bank of Canada. I already told you about how central banks have a role as interest rate setters, but I also mentioned their role as a lender of last resort. In other words, when the government can't get anyone else to lend the money, well, central banks will step in, and that happened during the pandemic. When the government of Canada needed to, in their eyes, this could be debated, but in their eyes needed to spend incredible amounts of money to support people and businesses throughout the pandemic, well, they weren't going to be able to borrow that money from the traditional lenders. Instead, they, through a number of different programs, borrowed this directly from the Bank of
Yeah, I can smell it. One thing that I actually bought for
person doesn't want to be on the channel was, I've done videos like this before. We got a Michael Jordan card. We did send it in. I had a buddy of mine send it in. It is in the process of coming back. So I told him, don't tell me nothing about it because I want to get a reaction on camera when we open it. So it's on its way back. I was hoping to have it by this coming Friday's video. So fingers crossed it'll come in the next couple days. We'll see what's up with it. So I've done videos like this before. Anybody remembers this there on the channel? I pawned this, and the guy didn't come back and pick it up. So it's a Nolan Ryan signed jersey. It has all its stats. Got the authenticity. I've also seen them online. It's numbered 234. This is 3 of 34. And I've seen them all over the place. I've seen them for. There's ones that's very similar to this, but not one for 34. Still the same stats. They sell for like 800 to 1,000. And then I've seen this one go anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 plus. And this one's framed. So I don't really know what it's worth. We paid 500 for it. Well, we loaned them 500 for it. I can pick it up. I got a $1,000 sticker on it. I'm gonna sit it out, see what it does. But one of the things that comes along with the pawn shop is we loan people money. They don't come back and get their stuff, and then we have to sell it. I think I found a good spot for this. I just gotta see if the sun gets rain to soon the baby. I see the sun getting not too bad with it. So I grabbed a few more things that these are some things that we don't put on this channel that sometimes a lot of people pawn. They didn't get that. First was the DeWalt radio. We loaned them $40 on it. They sell for about 100 to 120. Bluetooth radio, it's a battery or a charging cable. They didn't come out and get it. iPad Air, paid $250 for it. Well, I keep saying paid for a loan. Loaned them $250 on it. It sells for about $350 to $400. Oculus 3, 128 gigabyte. We loaned them 100 on it. They didn't come back and get it. They sell for like 200, 220, and another Xbox, which got a lot of things. So I really only started taking them if they're like really, really clean. This one's pretty clean. I think we loaned them $50 on that, and they didn't come back and get it. And one thing that I actually bought, but the person that was going to be on the channel was these blades. So I didn't really look at it. I did back set up. Gold right there. Please leave a comment down below. What's in all this stuff right here? Just these are gold right there.
Oh, okay.
Right. So none of this stuff right here. These are the 14 finger. 1.2 grams. Okay. And he's looking at that.
Oh, okay. I think it's silver stuff, but there again, it's not stained. So.
Yeah, $50 on those.
I found that brand online, but some of these are the same. Kind of got that same.
What do you want for this stuff?
Just whatever you think would be fair. I really don't know what it would be worth. Silver-wise, weight. Is it different? Okay, I didn't see a stamp on them. I just.
I don't typically do sunglasses.
I've never even worn those. It was a gift from my dad. It's not really my style, so.
Sunglasses are probably.
Okay. Let's see if I can style around too much anymore.
Like fine dance and those.
Probably, yeah.
These are coming back a little bit.
Are they? Yeah. Everything kind of does at some point. I doubt it. It was some stuff my dad had. I think my mom she was always into that kind of Indian style. And,
Yeah, this stuff is probably like 100 on it. These are 50 on.
Okay. And you're not interested on that. Okay. I do 150. That sounds Sounds fair.
I'm not doing a thing where like once a new set comes out, the old set that's like if Callaway comes out with new model.
Right. They definitely are. They probably take your older set and then tailor-made. But I'm missing an 8 iron, so it's help either. Maybe not.
I'm fighting for the United States. Canada and Mexico have taken a lot of our business over the years, over 25, 30 years, especially during the Biden years. It's basically all coming back into the United States now. Well, hot as a pistol, and it's coming back in because of tariffs and the incentives we give. It's coming back. We are working on something. We want to be very good to Canada. I like Carney a lot. I think he's a good person. He's removing his retaliatory tariffs, which I thought was nice. And we're going to have another call soon. Yeah, we had a very good call.
Team Trump making moves. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick meeting with Canada's trade minister in Washington to talk tariffs this week. This comes just days after Canada eased up on most of its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, a step Secretary Lutnick had pushed for, warning that there would be no real progress without that happening. Mr. Canadian,
Yeah,
what
really
is
interesting what happened.
you just represent all of Canada here.
Well, no, hey, look, I do business in all countries. I've got American kids, but I do investments up in Alberta. And here's what happened. Carney is really good because he used the whole Trump elbows up strategy to win against a conservative who was 32% ahead of him. And then he said, look, Trump is the enemy, and I'm going to say this. And it worked. But he just missed it by 3 seats. He has a minority mandate. In a Canadian parliamentary system, you can't get anything done unless you have a majority mandate. So what I predict will happen is we'll get another election, and one of these guys, which are so close, are going to win a majority. Who do you think will challenge him? Well, he has to challenge the Conservative and make the Republican. So one of those two guys has to win a majority mandate, because that's the only way you can actually execute policy. But right now, the pressure point is on softwood lumber. The rest of the stuff is CUSMA. That's the existing agreement. There are no tariffs. No tariffs out of Alberta oil. And if you took the Alberta oil out of the equation, there is no trade deficit with Canada. That is the cheapest oil America gets out of Alberta. And they have more net gas than the entire United States. So that's a lot of power up there. But they got to solve softwood lumber because that's the housing industry, and Trump knows it for housing. That's billions of dollars a month of softwood.
Prices, we would already be living in a completely The excitement of a new school year was quickly shattered in Minneapolis today. 2 children were killed and 17 others injured as they were praying. The FBI is now investigating the shooting as an act of domestic terrorism and a hate crime targeting Catholics. CTV's Michael Couture on what we know about the young victims.
The hugs are a little longer and a little tighter tonight in Minneapolis. In their first week of class, children at a Catholic school were targeted in a mass shooting that is being called cruel and cowardly.
Page troopers responding to receive Walmart medical.
Police say at around 8:30 this morning, the assailant fired multiple shots through the stained glass windows. Students and adults who were inside ducked and ran for cover.
I sprang under the pew, and then I covered my head. My friend saved me though, because he lay on top of me, and he got hit. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so scared. And so a teacher laid me downstairs. Me and my friend Cece were just praying.
2 children, aged 8 and 10, were killed. The 17 wounded are as young as 6, and the oldest is in their 80s.
There was some sort of manifesto that was timed to come out on YouTube. It's been taken down, and our investigators are going through that to try and develop a motive from that.
Police identified the shooter as 23-year-old Robin Westman, who died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The FBI director described Westman as a male, but legal documents requesting a name change say Westman identified as female.
I received my first Pokemon game in 2007. For Christmas, I had been given a copy of Pokemon Pearl. I'd seen a relative of mine playing with Pokemon cards, which was the catalyst for my interest in the entire franchise. To say I fell in love would probably be an understatement, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking about it right now. For the next several years, I became thoroughly obsessed. I played every game that came out after that. I even received Pokemon Emeralds. Gift, and it's been the only Game Boy game I've played in probably over a decade. I took that little Poké Walker to school every day because I wasn't allowed to bring my DS, and even if my parents had let me, I would have 100% gotten confiscated anyway. I still have that Poké Walker, by the way, and it still works. Now, I have a lot of fun playing these games, but starting where I did meant that for almost 4 years, the 493 Pokemon that comprised the National Dex of Gen 4 was everything I knew about Pokemon. Imagine my surprise when I learned that a new game in the series would drop in 2011, featuring all new Pokemon. To say I was excited wouldn't do it justice. When I was a kid, I didn't know anything about the development cycle of Pokemon. I didn't know they were going to make new ones. I immediately became super invested in learning everything I could about the games. I remember watching people's footage of the games in Japanese, because back then the games didn't have a worldwide release date. I understood none of what was being said, but it didn't matter to me because it was all new. My friends and I would go on Pokemon adventures during recess, talking about our favorite new Pokemon. On March 6, 2011, I made my parents take me to GameStop so I could pick up my pre-order of Pokemon Black. I would have beaten the game in a week, but I not ended up grounded for playing it too much. I loved the game as a child, and I've often revisited it to relive the nostalgia of being 11, playing my first ever new generation Pokemon experience. Now, I don't tell you all this just for fun. I think it's important, given that I'm about to launch into a full-on discussion of the entirety of Generation 5, that you know how I felt about them before I go any further. I think that 13 years of hindsight have warmed up a lot of people to these games, but I remember when I was a kid, this was not the same experience I shared. I remember a lot of people, particularly older fans, making fun of some of these designs, which, trust me, we will get into later on. I remember there being a not insignificant amount of hate toward these games when they came out. But I mean, what Pokemon game hasn't at this point? Though I am heavily biased in favor of these games, I do want to try and give a fair discussion about the generation as a whole, what I think works, and what I wish I had the power to change. Generation 5 marks a major turning point for Pokemon as a franchise, as these are the last games on the DS, and there were a lot of them. Not only that, advances in technology now meant that a handheld console had the power to render 3D models in both an efficient and sophisticated-looking way. Once the franchise makes the jump to the 3DS, this transition to 3D models will be permanent. The main goal is to look at what this means for the franchise, especially when we look at all these games as a send-off of sorts. But before we can talk about any of that, we do actually need to know what happens in these games. So, without further ado, the opening cutscene for this game is actually very informative for the story we're about to experience. I'll admit, if you pay enough attention, it does kinda spoil something later in the game. But I love that right off the bat, and I mean right off the bat, the game is trying to convey part of the narrative to us. And what's cooler is that our character is never privy to this scene. It basically serves as a teaser for you, the player. Who are those girls? Who's the guy in the robe? Why are they putting a crown on Wally? Stuff like that. Of course, after this scene, we're treated to the normal style of Pokemon intro, showcasing various elements from throughout the actual game. Creating your character is the standard Pokemon affair, especially for 2011. Gender, name, here are your rivals, notably you do not name them this time. Welcome to the world of Pokemon. The next thing that happens is the game displays the season for you, which is immediately strange, especially because the season is probably wrong. Until putting this video together, I never actually bothered to learn how the season mechanic worked, but the short version is that instead of rotating every 3 months, the season rotates every month instead, each one changing the map in some way. I actually think this is kind of cool. It means that if you want to explore everywhere, you'll have to wait for the season to change, or just change the DS clock if you're a cheater. I also want to clarify that I will be playing through these games on set mode. Not because I think they're too easy, but because I want to impress you, the viewer. Back in our house, you choose a starter, and then your friends Sharon and Bianca choose theirs, and the battle ensues. I like how battling indoors causes such a mess in this opening scene. Neither you nor your Pokemon have any experience in battling, so it makes sense that it wouldn't go super cleanly. After this moment, the game proceeds like you would expect it to. Go to the professor, get a Pokedex, learn to catch a Pokemon, walk to the first city, learn what a Pokemon Center does. In Gen 5, they actually moved the Pokemon into the Pokemon Center, which makes buying stuff a whole lot more convenient. We actually get our first taste of the story pretty quickly, as walking outside brings us face-to-face with Team Plasma, who says they want to liberate Pokemon from people, a cause that sounds like it has the best of intentions. After their spiel, this random guy approaches us and wants to battle. I feel dumb for giving a spoiler warning for a 13-year-old game, but I'm gonna do it anyway. If you want to play this game and you haven't by now, I think you should do it blind, but I'm just gonna assume that everyone has and move on from there. This is the first of many times that we'll hear M's theme. It's a pretty good theme right now, but it definitely feels a little empty, which is convenient because it actually does change over the course of the game. I don't want to go into a full comparison right now because I have a flow to keep, but I want you to remind me to come back to it later on, okay? Team Plasma's goal as a whole is a pretty serious topic for a Pokemon game, at least when compared to stealing everything for fun or trying to flood the entire world. There is an actual discussion you can have on the morality of Team Plasma's goal when compared to a group like Team Galactic or Team Rocket. Hell, even the Gen 3 teams have some pretty extremist views, but it's still a step up from creating a new world and killing everyone. This noble cause will be completely ruined by the end of the game, with the exception of one character. Also, my Snivy is shiny now, don't worry, he does that. One feature I think is pretty neat, if entirely missable, is how certain NPCs have the ability to add to the music in a given place. It transitions pretty seamlessly too, and once I found these NPCs, I wanted to find more of them in order to hear what they all sounded like together. It's a small reason, sure, but it did make me want to explore more of the world. Let's actually talk about the in-game music for a minute. I think over the years, the aspect of these games that has arguably aged the best, I would certainly argue this, is the music. The black and white soundtrack is composed by Shota Kageyama, Junichi Masuda, Hitomi Sato, Go Ichinose, Morikazu Aoki, Minako Adachi, and Satoshi Nahara. I am deeply sorry if I said any of those names wrong. I probably said all of them wrong. Some of the most iconic sounds of the franchise come from the black and white soundtrack, and many of these songs are still popular, with compilations of them getting millions of views on YouTube. The low health theme is probably the most iconic piece from the soundtrack, turning the monotonous blinking sound into a genuine theme that conveys not only the intensity of the situation with the almost panic notes, but a genuinely good piece of music is impressive to me. I'm honestly surprised that this idea never makes a reappearance after Generation 5, but I suppose doing away with the constant sound altogether is not a bad alternative. I don't want to go over all the iconic music right now because some of it is tied to story beats or locations, but suffice it to say, I enjoy a lot of this music independently of the game. Pokemon's music really never misses as long as they have more than like 4 bits. Mom uncripples our legs and it's time to head to Striation City. What's unique about the first gym is that its type actually changes depending on which starter you have. There's a focus here on trying to teach you how type matchups work, which I really like in a first gym. The leader's ace will always be super effective against your starter, which can make this fight hard considering how very few ways you have to obtain Pokemon with types other than normal and flying in the early stages of the game. However, you can obtain an elemental monkey that beats the one the leader has from a girl in the Dream Yard. I can appreciate that the game makes an effort to teach you the type matchup system here. Of course, it's not perfect. There are 17 types in this game, and they all interact differently against one another, but it is a starting point. The rest you'll largely have to learn through trial and error, unless you look them up, but that was a little less common in 2011. I honestly wish we had more gyms that break the standard conventions in this game. I mean, Opelousas City does kind of have 2 leaders, but their teams are identical to one another. We do eventually see the gym structure changed for real in Sun and Moon, but at this point in time, the formula remains largely unchanged. Heading back to the Dream Yard, we actually have an interesting encounter with Team Plasma. A couple members are kicking a Munna in an attempt to extract the Dream Mist from it. Why exactly do they want the Dream Mist? Unclear. Maybe they're going to make people have dreams of releasing their Pokemon, I don't know. This encounter goes against the ideology Team Plasma was just spouting back in Aspertia City, talking about liberating Pokemon from the tyranny of humans. This abuse is the exact kind of tyranny that I assume gets us to speaking about, and it's unclear how much of this is made aware to the higher-ups of Team Plasma. This action immediately puts the group in a gray area in a best-case scenario. Of course, this is something we see in the real world, too. An organization that has a mixed record when it comes to animals is PETA. I don't really want to tackle the full history of PETA, as that's not the focus of this video, but a very brief summary is they were originally founded in the 1980s and early on helped to free Silver Spring monkeys that were being experimented on from a lab in Maryland, which were later taken during a police raid. A series of events which ultimately resulted in the Animal Welfare Act in the United States. In the modern day, their legacy is a little more nebulous. Common sentiment online tends to view the group in a negative light. One of their controversies involved the high euthanasia rates at their shelters. In the past, PETA has claimed that they received animals that are either too old or too sick and view the shelters as a place of last resort. They view euthanizing these animals as an act of mercy. I'm not here to pass judgment on PETA, and please do not use my summary to form a judgment about them. There are dozens more resources that will give you a better analysis than my Pokemon video. My point is that organizations with good intentions can still have these gray areas to them. Of course, the power of foresight tells us that, spoiler alert, Team Plasma is far less, quote-unquote, morally gray than they appear to be right here, but let's table that conversation for later. While we're on the subject of PETA, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Pokemon Black and Blue, a parody game in which Pikachu helps to free other Pokemon from trainers who are physically abusing them. This game released a couple months after Black 2 and White 2, and seems to me to be the inverse of these games taken to the extreme. For now, though, let's just remember this game exists and agree to come back to it later. Getting to the second gym is probably the slowest point in the story, at least for me. I always have a hard time getting past the beginning phase of any game. I really enjoy the mid-game portion of Pokemon, so that could contribute to why I think it goes by so slowly. In a lot of Pokemon games, the plot hasn't really kicked in until about midway through, so we're largely just challenging gyms and occasionally encountering a generic bad guy. Anyways, we're at Nacrene City. What happened in between? I don't know. Team Plasma, probably. Nacrene City has a very artsy warehouse-style vibe to it, but its defining landmark feature is the Pokemon gym that is also a museum. The guy in the museum gives us a tour. We see a big ash dragon and Reshiram. We beat Lenora, and because I lost the footage, we're just going to brush past some of this stuff real quick. Normal gyms tend to be somewhat challenging in the early game. Whitney and her Miltank are the most notorious example of this, but Lenora's no slouch either. You don't have a wide pool of Pokemon to hit super effectively, and almost none of them resist a normal type. Thankfully, you can at least pick up a fighting type nearby if you're really struggling to defeat Lenora. The story kicks in again here, and we start to get glimpses of the true intentions of Team Plasma as they steal the big skull from the dragon. We have to help solve this mystery because we're the main character, which begins the pattern of story elements being blocked off, keeping us on a strict path forwards. This starts to happen a lot before we can even challenge gyms. These games obviously didn't invent this mechanic or even come close to being the first to do this, but it does frequently happen in this game. In previous ones, there are often moments where you can take on certain gyms in the order of your choice or even accidentally skip certain ones. You will, of course, have to beat them eventually in order to enter Victory Road, but you still have that level of flexibility. In Black and White, and in Black 2 White 2, no such option is offered to you as the player. Gyms have always had bottlenecks in the form of HMs, allowing you to either clear or move hazards to get to new areas, but these games, more often than not, just stop you from going somewhere by putting an NPC in your way so you clear a given objective. In fact, you only really need HMs to complete side content and optional objectives. The only one you'll ever be directly required to use is Cut, and that's pretty much right at the beginning of the game. In fact, I've already done it. This moment, right here, this is the only time you're ever required to use an HM. Surf, Strength, both entirely optional. On one hand, it's nice, because having a dedicated HM slave sucks, and a lot of the moves aren't really that good to begin with, except for Surf. And on the other hand, why even include so many of them at this point, and why even make them HMs in the first place? You don't even need badges to use them, that's how little bearing they have on the story. You're barred from entering Pinwheel Forest until you've completed an Acrian Gem, and afterwards you're barred from leaving it until you solve the Team Plasma crisis. Venturing into the forest deep enough, we finally find the Plasma members who stole the skull, and I do think there's a neat moment here where Gorm tells us that Getsus will liberate Pokemon instead of N. My assumption is that they want to save the reveal that N is the leader of Team Plasma for later, but it is a neat bit of foreshadowing. We'll talk a little more about the hierarchy of Team Plasma in a bit, but it turns out this skull is not the ancient Pokemon they were looking for. Now that Team Plasma has finally been cleared out, we can talk about one of the most impactful moments in the entire game for me, Sky Arrow Bridge. I'm not sure I have the right words to express how much this location impacted me as a kid, but I'm going to give it my best effort. By the time this game had come out, I had played through Emerald, Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver. For most of my time playing Pokemon, the games had a pretty static top-down view. The only other moment that stands out to me is the Distortion World, which, to be fair, is spectacular. Of course, the Distortion World is what Pokemon Platinum has been building to the whole time. It was the biggest addition to the game, at least from my memory. Sky Arrow Bridge happens pretty early on in the game, and it has multiple camera angles as well as a moving camera. The Distortion World is designed to be impressive, but to me, Sky Arrow Bridge is designed to be cinematic, and the game has practically just started. It's pretty bold in my mind to do something like this so early, because I definitely think it sets the bar for what the game is capable of. And I think it delivers. Castelia City immediately follows this, and the design of the city is something that you could not accomplish in a 2D game with the static camera of Generation 4. Castelia City is easily one of my favorite locations in Pokemon for how it feels. This is the first time that a city felt like an actual city. We see all these people moving by as we walk up and down the streets the way they do their best to move around us, each one of them just trying to get to their own destination, each one living their own life. I am curious what a Castelia City would look like in a remake of these games. If you're from the future, hey, I hope they did a good job. But honestly, I don't think it'll be able to compare to the original. Castelia actually feels like a lived-in place, not just a small town with a handful of NPCs. And for a Pokemon game with a DS, with the hardware limitations that came with that, I think that's pretty impressive. But what can we do here? It's cool that this city actually feels like a city, but as the central hub of Unova, what can you do here? I honestly wish that the battle subway was in Castelia, because my biggest gripe is how Nimbasa feels like the center of Unova. It doesn't help that it's part of the big loop that defines the region, but all these stadiums and the music hall also reside there, as well as a theme park. The amount of stuff Nimbasa has going on compared to Castelia is honestly a little disappointing to me, and I really think adding the battle subway here would help to have more of a reason to be here, especially later in the game. Not to mention that it is literally New York, a city famous for its subway. Are you kidding? I recognize that Castelia probably has a lot going on behind the scenes technologically, and that could make it difficult to add any new expansions like that. I don't know, I'm not a programmer. But I feel like for as many buildings as there are in this city, surely you could have put the battle subway in one of them. I'm getting off track though. Let's talk about one of my favorite locations in this game, Liberty Garden. Liberty Garden is another in a series of locations you could only access with certain items. These items are usually only made available through limited distribution. Gen 4 had a lot of these, being the primary way to get Darkrai, Shaman, and Arceus. This concept gets shelved after Gen 5, and this is the only location in either set of games that you have to access this way. Even in Black 2 and White 2, you don't need the Liberty Pass to visit here. Granted, you also can't catch Victini in those games either. which leads me to suspect that the player catching Victini is actually canon. What I find cool about this place over locations like New Moon Island is how this encounter actually flows with the story, provided you do it when you come here for the first time. Plasma's here attempting to take Victini for themselves, and once we put a stop to them, we're actually allowed to attempt to bring her along on our journey. Victini is shiny now, don't worry, she does that. But while I'm cheating, let's talk about one of the mechanics that this game introduces, the shiny lock. See, starting in Gen 5 and onwards, certain Pokemon are hard-coded to never appear shiny. I doubt I have to explain this, but just to cover my bases, shiny Pokemon are palette-swapped variants that have a 1 in 8,192 chance of appearing every time you encounter a Pokemon. From the time they were introduced until Generation 5, every Pokemon had a chance to appear shiny, including legendary ones. Starting in these games, though, certain Pokemon could no longer do that. Reshiram and Zekrom were the main two, but Victini was also on that list as well. This change has always baffled me. It's a level of control I've never really been able to understand. Pokemon is predominantly an offline single-player game. More importantly, having a shiny Pokemon doesn't provide you with any advantages in battle. They all function the same. Shiny Pokemon really only prove your commitment to some code with a different color, kind of like skins in a video game, except they're not worth anything. Ultimately, it harms nobody to allow this Pokemon to be shiny, so I've never really understood why we just can't be trusted with this mechanic. It's only gotten worse over time, too, as the list of shiny-locked Pokemon as of Scarlet and Violet is quite long and even extends to the starters of that generation. My best guess is that this has been a tool to get people to partake in events that are distributed later on in the game's lifespan. Of course, this kind of falls apart when we consider that there's no way to legitimately obtain a shiny Victini. It's never even been distributed. All I can do is speculate on the reasoning, but at any rate, this change is among my least favorite for the seemingly random decision to stop players from playing the game however they see fit. Back in Castelia, we have to deal with Team Plasma before we can take on Berg's gym. Bianca's had her mana stolen by Team Plasma, who we eventually track down to their new base of operations in Castelia, which happens to be right across from the gym. Inside, we encounter Getsus, as well as two other members of the Seven Sages, Blue and Bronius. Getsus talks to us about the creation of Unify, about the hero who used Pokemon of ideas to unify the hearts of people. He intends to do so again. He can't help himself. He talks about creating the kind of world he desires. Very Pokemon antagonist here. This moment outlines the clear dissonance between Team Plasma's words and their actions, something Berg says outward. One thing I really like about the gym leaders in this game is how they have occupations and interactions outside of the gym. The three leaders of Striation operate professionally. Laura operates a museum, which houses the second gym. Berg is an artist. Giving the gym leaders jobs helps fill out the world. I know that you could argue that in the Pokemon universe being a gym leader probably is a job, and that's fair. But I feel like even in the Pokemon anime, we never see loads of people rushing to chill at the gym on a regular basis. I could definitely see being a gym leader something these people almost volunteer to do, effectively making it a hobby. It also explains how the Pokemon League has enough money to build a big fucking palace as they occasionally release for and House of Champion. Giving them all jobs is a pretty great method of characterizing people in society. It's such a simple and effective way to convey character traits, and it just helps to make the world feel more real. This, combined with the larger role the gym leaders have in the story, helps to give them a bigger sense of importance in the world they're trying to run. Even the prominence of Pokemon battles within the world, it makes a lot of sense that the gym leaders have some level of influence or authority. Their extra input in the story really reflects this. A lot of the gym leaders in older games have very few moments outside the gyms we find them in, and even less have impacts on the narrative of their regions. Hell, in Gen 3, one of the gym leaders is your father, and I'm pretty sure he never leaves the gym. I don't love the Castelia gym. Sorry to anyone who's a big fan. I just don't love this puzzle or the way the gym looks. I'll confess that I am biased against this gym from the get-go as a grass-type starter enthusiast, but also because the first time I played this game, I didn't understand how to get through these honey barriers for like 7 minutes. I do like that the gym at least has a puzzle, but I think the design of this gym does put me off of it. Like, it's cool that it's a honeycomb, but the gym is green, brown, and yellow. Like, Bird, you're an artist. Surely you could have made a more visually appealing gym. I know he can, and he kind of does later on, or at least he comes a lot closer. Before we leave Castelia City, there's one more thing I want to touch on. Tucked away in one of the buildings is a boy who doesn't speak. If you bring a Celebi, having been met in a faithful encounter, then the boy is revealed to be a Zorba, and he'll actually join your party. Now, this is kind of a neat way to obtain a Pokemon. I don't know why Celebi specifically reveals this boy, but it's still neat. And if you got the Celebi when the game came out, then you can snag this guy for your team pretty early on. The problem here is that this is the only way to obtain a Zorua in this game without breeding. Zoroark's not any easier to get, as you need a different legendary event Pokemon, and then you have to find him in a forest by Nacrene City. There is no other way to obtain these Pokemon in this game. I like the idea of a Pokemon that has some semblance of rarity to it, even if you can just breed more of them. Remember this because we will be coming back to it later, but locking Zorua and Zoroark behind event distribution Pokemon feels so bad to me because you had to be able to use Wi-Fi to obtain these Pokemon at the time the game came out, or physically go to GameStop to receive them. And after that window passed, they just aren't accessible without cheating or exploiting the DS's Wi-Fi capability. Castelia has left a pretty strong impression on me, as strong as a digital city in a children's monster fighting game can. It really changed the way I look at Pokemon as it's represented in the games. I always recognized the small city layout was not indicative of the actual place they were trying to represent. Goldenrod City is more than just a series of small houses with a department store and radio plant. There's always a little suspension of disbelief, especially in the early days. But Castelia City isn't one of the first to actually try and make the city feel larger, make it feel lived in, feel like a city. You know this is heavily based on the United States, and even at a glance it's obvious which city they're trying to emulate, and here's some early alive called Liberty Island. Nostalgia is almost certainly a factor. The place has always felt impressive, and I hope they do justice to it. Route 4 is pretty unremarkable at this point. We have another battle with Chair and totally smoke his ass, and now we have to trek through the desert. There isn't too much I want to say right now, but it's clear that they're working on some kind of project out here. Why they've chosen to go to the desert is beyond me, though. The desert resort, also nearby, not really important enough to talk about just yet either. It does have some funny monkey statues, though, so that's kind of neat. I will say I do like how we see the beginnings of the infrastructure here on Route 4, and I don't want to spoil too much in this 13-year-old game. There will be a reason for this, so let's just put it on the pile of things I want to talk about in the next game. The Mombasa City kind of confuses me. I already talked about how I don't love that it's really the game's hub. Geographically, I get it. It connects both the Unova Loop as well as Castelia and early game areas. Mechanically, though, I don't really get why it's here. Well, I guess when I say it's the game's hub, I suppose I really mean that it's just home to the Battle Subway and the Music Hall. Maybe calling the Music Hall posting content is too generous, though. When I first played this game, I expected the Music Hall to be like contests from Gen 3 and 4, which it decidedly is not. It's a unique feature, but I've never really found myself participating in it once or twice. Just in case you forgot, this game is set in the US, Mombasa City has not one, but 2 stadiums where they're practicing football and basketball. This place is full of little things to do, even if they don't all have a lot of replay value. I think this is reflected in the gym, honestly. Located in the theme park section of the city, Elisa's gym is an amusement park, and while this gym doesn't really contain a puzzle, it's probably still my favorite in the game for its visual design. I mean, filling your gym with roller coasters is bound to make it stand out, and for no other reason than the visual of all the different colors and parts. I've enjoyed coming to this gym every time I play these games, and hitting the loop right before Elisa proves this game loves to pull out random little things like this seemingly out of nowhere. It's hard for me to envision something like this, even when comparing the games to Generation 4. And I don't mean this as a slight to them, I think it's purely because of the time in which they came out. The DS launched in 2004, and Diamond and Pearl launched in 2007. This gives Pokemon Black and White an additional 5 years of hardware and software developments. And by this point, there was a new DS system in the form of the DSi. Back outside the gym, we encounter Im, who reveals that he is the king of Team Plasma, which isn't the most shocking reveal, and Im's deep affinity for Pokemon, coupled with his ability to talk to them, does closely align him with Team Plasma's goal of freeing Pokemon, something we even can see and practicing, using Pokemon for only one battle before returning them to the wild. This is something that the game doesn't really spell out for us yet, but we'll see a lot more of it as we move forward. Im stalls for his Team Plasma members so they can evade capture by you and actually pause. How much of Team Plasma's activity does Im actually know about? Like, I doubt he's aware of some of these people trying to beat up Pokemon for Dream Myths, and I definitely don't think this is an isolated incident. If we look at it this way, I think Im is either not the kind of person he presents himself as, or he's not really in charge of Team Plasma. And this is honestly a pretty neat way of foreshadowing this more than just Ghetsis letting the mask slip so early in the game. I honestly wish that this moment had come sooner in the game. I like the idea that we meet Im, get to know him as a somewhat reasonable individual, and then learn that he's the king of Team Plasma, only to find that Plasma is doing all this nefarious shit in the background. I also think Gets' little outbursts undermine his perception as this cunning and shrewd manipulator, as he can't even keep the mask on after being presented with just a hint of resistance at the hands of a 14-year-old. Now it's time to talk about what is arguably one of the more forgettable mechanics in Black and White. I mean, I don't know that they beat out the music hall in terms of how often I forget about them, but I mean, Game Freak sure did. Let's talk about triple and rotation battles. In Gen 3, Pokemon introduces double battles, and they were a big success. They provided a lot more complexity to battles, and I think they're pretty easy to get the hang of. Low skill floor, high skill ceiling. In fact, Pokemon's official competitive format, the VGC, is conducted entirely through double battles. Gen 4 didn't introduce any new battle styles, so Black and White took it upon themselves to introduce 2 more. These styles are kind of like version exclusives, but not really. Each game does focus on one of the 2 styles, but you can participate in both no matter which game you bought. In Pokemon Black, for instance, the one I'm playing, you're primarily partaking in rotation battles. That's what Charles here is going to challenge us to. There is exactly 1 triple battle in this game, which you can only access after the main story has been completed. Triple battles are a fairly natural extension of double battles. Now, there are 3 Pokemon to each side, except they all can't attack one another. The battlefield's too large. Instead, they can only attack the Pokemon adjacent to them, with the exception of certain moves. The Pokemon in the center obviously have the best position, and as such, the Pokemon that are not in the center have the option to shift instead of making a move. Triple battles are complicated, to say the least. Double battles already increase the number of different possible options by a lot, and triple battles obviously create even more possibilities than that. Rotation battles are even weirder. Each player sends out 3 Pokemon, but unlike triple battles, this is still technically 1v1. The gimmick comes in the form of the fact that you can rotate which of the 3 Pokemon is in the center. Unlike shifting in triple battles, you can rotate your teammates and still attack, effectively allowing for free switching. Your opponent knows which 2 Pokemon you could switch into. This effectively turns the game into predicting your opponent even more so than Pokemon battles already were. Rotation battles definitely feel a lot more gimmicky than triple battles, and I don't know that either of them feels like a very competitive format. These styles do technically appear again in Gen 6, but it's almost exclusively through the restaurants in X and Y. My main issue with these battle styles was a lack of support, especially in the first half of Generation 5. There are 6 rotation battles in Pokemon Black, and all of them are optional fights. You can go the entire game and never partake in either of these styles. White has 6 triple battles instead, and both games have the one optional battle located on Marvelous Bridge. They do make a bigger effort to have these styles be part of the game in Black 2, White 2, including requiring triple battles and rotation battles in the Opelousas City Gym. But I feel like at that point it's kind of too little too late. Those games didn't sell as well as Black and White, so your best chance to get people interested was the first go-around. And even if you did get people interested, once you beat those 6 trainers, the only way to have more battles is through a trainer you can fight once a day in Opelousas City. It's just not a good way to sustain people's interest. And it's pretty clear that it didn't. They phased them out after Gen 6. In fact, I forgot they were even in Gen 6 to begin with. Where the hell are we again? Oh right, Driftveil City, baby! There's no forgetting this soundtrack. Easily the most iconic city theme in the entire game. Driftveil City reminds me a lot of some of the locations in Gen 4. I think it's mostly all the mountainy texture the city has. It gives off the same energy as Canalave City. I don't know how else to describe it. Having cold storage here always felt weird. Maybe it's just because I assume this place is Texas because of Clay, but it just doesn't feel like it fits very well. I feel like I'd expect to see this more in like Castelia City because it's the center of nowhere, or maybe like Mishrawan because of the airport. After beating the Texas-type gym leader, we now get to make our way to Chargestone Cave. I love this place for how much it stands out compared to caves in other Pokemon games. It's actually so visually interesting that sometimes I forget it's a cave. It's different designs. I just think it feels so alive, the way the ground surges with electricity, the crystals move when you walk under them, and the ones that magnetize to the bigger crystals. It's kind of like a nice puzzle, but without actually sliding out. We encounter Inn in Chargestone Cave, who challenges us to a battle. Inn talks more about his vision for, the masks if we have our own opinions. Say yes, he was going to demonstrate that for that. On defeating him, he seems a little unsure of himself. Inn doesn't understand Pokemon battles, he just views them as Pokemon getting hurt. He doesn't want to be a trainer, but recognizes that he needs the help of Pokemon in order to free them. I suspect this is why he releases the Pokemon he uses after battles. He doesn't want them to be getting hurt, but he needs their help nonetheless. He quickly switches back by saying that battles cannot help him pursue his goals, as if he thinks that the legendary Pokemon will down him. Inn then complains to Juniper about the Pokedex, saying that he doesn't like humans dictating the categorization of Pokemon. He doesn't like how Juniper's inspiring the status quo. To me, this comes off as kind of a weird stance for him to take. Juniper's research arguably helps people to better understand Pokemon, and she likely carries a lot of weight as research. Her lack of a desire to help the Pokemon the way it wants to is somewhat understandable. There is something of an exchange taking place when researching Pokemon. She gets to understand them, and they get to be understood. Juniper tells him that he's allowed to feel this way, and says that maybe everyone should be allowed to relate to Pokemon as basic. He argues that people should be allowed to do whatever they want to Pokemon, and says he can't allow that to ruin the relationship. I think N is more in the right hand. We see his own platform to do whatever they want to Pokemon, as well as the other evil things in Pokemon. I think Juniper is getting something that's close to the truth, but there probably isn't just one way to look at the relationship between Pokemon. But I don't know that it's really important to decide that. It makes a pretty big point about how it is actually capable of talking to Pokemon, just understanding them. And it stands to reason and has come to this conclusion from the experiences he hears about from Pokemon, not just the things he himself has witnessed. For now, though, we've made it to Stroughton City, which could just as easily be mistaken for a town. What amuses me is that aside from the gym, the defining feature of the city is the airport, which in this game doesn't actually do anything. I don't think that it doesn't do anything. It's another example of world building that shows us the player doesn't have access to everything. There are things going on in the background that we're simply not privy to. It'd be cool if we could see planes take off in the same way we see cars and boats going by on the sky or a bridge. I would even accept just having the noise of the planes taking off. I recognize that this is something of a minor nitpick, but the city definitely feels like it has the least going on compared to everywhere else we've been before this. Before we're allowed to take on the gym, we first have to scale the Celestial Tower. This is the last iteration of such a building in a Pokemon game. Pokemon had always sought fit to include some kind of cemetery for deceased Pokemon. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, Mount Pyre in Hoenn, and the Lost Tower in Sinnoh. This has always been somewhat of a dark topic for a children's game. Lavender Tower has always had very unsettling music, but the Pokemon Tower plays a big role in why it feels so unsettling, why we have a Lavender Town syndrome. Lavender Town is so macabre because of the Pokemon graveyard. Nevertheless, it's an important piece of world building, a reminder that in this world full of fun creatures, they are animals that need to be cared for. And given the topic of these games, this is the most important such a tower has ever been in a Pokemon game. It goes to show us that N is not entirely right about his view of the way the relationship between people and Pokemon is treated. Nobody would mourn the loss of something they view as a tool, and they definitely wouldn't build a monument to one. Ascending to the top, Skyla asks us to ring the bell, an act which commemorates the Pokemon that you have lost. Of course, you can't ever directly lose a Pokemon in the main series Pokemon games. No Pokemon you ever have will actually die. But I have no doubt that for one reason or another, anyone who's played more than one Pokemon game has lost a Pokemon that had some level of significance. My first ever starter, Turtwig, was ultimately lost to me when I traded it to someone for an Alakazam. I never got him back. I have named every Turtwig I've ever had since then Awesome because of this. I don't know why Game Freak stopped making places like this. I know it wasn't because the series got lighter. Newer games take on just as serious topics, if not more so. Sun and Moon deal with parental issues, the relationship between Lusamine and her children. Scarlet and Violet do too, in something of a similar manner. I won't spoil the game if you haven't played it yet, that's not what this video is about, but for those who have, Pokemon definitely did not get less serious as time went on, so why stop talking about those who passed away? Why stop talking about those who lost? Maybe it's pathetic? I mean, I can imagine that a funeral car might feel out of place in cheery alone, because for the other games, I genuinely have no clue. Once we've rung the bell, Skyla returns to Stroughton City's gym, which allows us to proceed with the story. I have a confession. The very first time I went through this gym, I had no clue where to go. Once I got to the third cannon, the little gray bar that tells you which direction the cannon can fire was blocked by that little traffic cone line, and I spent more time than necessary trying to figure out where to go. But otherwise, this gym isn't too bad. You literally get shot out of the cannon and slam into the wall. It's not too bad. I think the vanillish largely for this gym, and he makes pretty easy work of it. I didn't talk about Alder the first time we met him, but I think we're going to now. I'll admit this is partially because I do like watching him break his legs. Alder often appears to challenge Charon's notion of what makes a strong trainer. Charon begins the game believing the strength is everything, and looks up to Alder because he's powerful. And in most of Alder's interactions, he spends them explaining to Charon why strength isn't the only thing you need. Charon reminds me a lot of Silver from Gen 2. Silver is someone who believes that might is the only thing that matters. Use those to express anything else as weak. Cares for his Pokemon only so far as he can use them to be strong, at least in the beginning. Charon is far less cool than Silver is, and while both of them undergo a change of character, Charon has an understanding that Pokemon are more than just tools of power, something Silver doesn't seem to know. From one cave dungeon to another, Twist Mountain is not as interesting as Sharpstone Cave. It's much more of a traditional cave dungeon in Pokemon. But it does have one neat trick up its sleeve. Twist Mountain has a large central excavation pit that you have to navigate in order to get to Icarus City. What's interesting is that during the winter, the layout of this section changes pretty significantly, as the whole thing fills with snow. There's actually one room in this place that's only accessible during the winter, as well as a couple of platforms that are normally blocked off. This also blocks off some of the other areas as well, but not so many of them can't still get through the mountain. Because of this change, Twist Mountain is really only interesting to me during the winter, and the rest of the time it feels pretty generic. Arriving in Icarus City, Cedric Juniper tells us about the Dragon Spiral Tower, rumored to be the oldest building in Unova. The issue is that nobody has been inside it in a long time. There's not a real way into the tower, and investigating this for ourselves proves it to be true, but no doubt that Team Plasma is also looking for a way in themselves. This is undoubtedly due to the tower's link to the legendary dragons. Icarus City is another place that has areas only accessible during the winter. One of the houses rests on a hilltop that we cannot access during the other seasons. What's neat about this house is that the man inside of it is actually a former member of Team Rocket. This member is the one who steals the machine part from the power plant in Kansas, stopping the train system and the Lavender Town radio from working. You can also obtain a Rage candy bar from his wife. Another interesting fact about the city is that you can encounter Pokemon here without fishing. Walking along the water actually has a chance to initiate a battle, which is kind of neat because it's not really common to have something like this in a Pokemon game. In fact, this trait isn't even unique to Unova if you're playing Pokemon White. I actually kind of like ice puzzles. I don't know if that's a weird thing to say or not. I mean, I don't want like a prolonged area of them, but I like when a specific area, like the Icarus Gym, consists of them. I like trying to find the best route, and I actually enjoy when a gym contains a puzzle. I don't love having to deal with a bunch of ice-type Pokemon as someone who always picks the grass starter. With our friend, the secret Pokemon, we should be able to make pretty quick work of the gym. Bryson is probably my favorite gym leader in this game. The little girl actually mentions that Bryson used to be in movies a long time ago, a very unusual and not at all relevant detail that may or may not definitely come up again later. I really like how Bryson's design kind of betrays what I expect him to be. I definitely viewed him as somebody who would be a lot more stoic and reserved. An actor is not what I would have guessed his profession to be, that's for sure. We do still get to see that he's a very skilled individual, though, as no sooner do we leave his gym than he detects the Shadow Triad before they even reveal themselves. We also see Charon having a little bit of a crisis, wondering if he's actually getting any stronger, or if it's just his Pokemon. I feel like I've gone too long without talking about Bianca. I mean, to be fair, I also think I went too long without talking about Charon, so here we are. Bianca spends most of the game arguing with her father about going on a Pokemon journey. Her father doesn't want her to be a Pokemon trainer, which is something we learn right at the start of the game. Bianca is depicted as the weakest trainer out of the three of us, but continually expresses her determination to keep trying. This eventually comes to a head in Mombasa City when Bianca encounters her father again, who has learned where she was and has come to take her back to November Town despite her protesting. This conversation is interrupted by Elisa, who tells Bianca that her father is worried about her because the world is a dangerous place, but that Bianca is not alone, and she's surrounded by people who want to help her. This is yet another example of one of the game's major themes, the idea that people's viewpoints are not necessarily wrong just because they're in opposition to each other. Both characters have a point, but it's their handling of this difference that's important. We're going to put a large pin in this because we have more story to talk about before I finish unpacking all the themes, but we really need to talk about in order to get the whole picture. Now that we've completed the 7th gym, it's time for the story to take center stage. This is pretty common in Pokemon. You don't make it to Sunny Shore until after completing Spear Pillar, or completing the Cave of Origin before taking on Sootopolis Gym. We're instructed to visit Dragon Spiral Tower, which has been taken over by Team Plasma. In lieu of taking on Plasma in their headquarters, this is our largest confrontation with them. We didn't talk much about Celestial Tower, but I like how the changes in the camera movement allow for the towers that are more than just a top-down view of the floor. We can have spiral staircases instead of ladders or a short set of stairs. Of course, in order to do this, the camera has to lock onto it, because omnidirectional control is still not possible on a DS. I can't fully explain why the cutscene in Dragon Spiral Tower has left such an impression on me. It's not particularly complex, it's just a scene featuring a 2D in and Zekrom. It's not really long either, yet when I think back on these games, this is one of the first things that always comes to my mind. Maybe it's because there just weren't a lot of 3D cutscenes in Pokemon at the time. I don't want to sit here and pretend like Pokemon Black is some revolutionary cutscenes of things that I was... Well, it's not particularly... complex. It's just a scene featuring a 2D in and Zekrom. It's not really long either, yet when I think back on these games, this is one of the first things that always comes to my mind. Maybe it's because there just weren't a lot of 3D cutscenes in Pokemon at the time. I don't want to sit here and pretend like Pokemon Black is some revolutionary game for the DS. Games had been using 3D models on the system well before this, including all the way back to the launch of the system in 2004. Pokemon had always been primarily a 2D game, and getting to see these creatures realized and animated was always neat, and in Gen 4 these cutscenes weren't very common. Offhand, I can really only remember Giratina from Pokemon Platinum leaping out to attack you at Spear Pillar in the Binding of Dialga and Palkia, also at Spear Pillar. Make no mistake, I love the 2D style of the older Pokemon games. In fact, I prefer it to the 3D ones. I have no doubt that part of this is nostalgia, of course, but I also like how lively the sprites feel, which I feel is especially true with the Gen 5 anime ones. Generation 6 made many Pokemon feel very static and boring, even more so than some of the old sprites. Several of the 3D models suffer from becoming desaturated as well. Some of the most notable examples of this are Shiny Gengar and Shiny Regice, being virtually indistinguishable from their regular counterparts. Sprites had the task of creating a sense of life in these still images, but the 3D models can actually be animated. Keyword being can.
There were lots of Pokemon whose 3D models are a lot less visually interesting than their 2D sprites. I think Electros is one of the best examples I can think of. Its sprite, which I will admit does not convey the fact that this thing has levitate, makes Electros feel large and lively. The way the patterns on its body flicker with electricity as it moves around. And then the 3D model just kind of floats there. It looks tiny. There are more examples of this too, it's not just Electros. The sprite for Skarmory makes it seem very defensive and territorial, like we're trespassing. The animated sprite makes it seem extra angry too with all those moving metal feathers. It makes me think of the hair on a cat standing up, or the quills of the hedgehog. 3D Skarmory is just kind of floating there, barely moves. Not all of the 2D sprites feel more lively than their 3D counterparts, but I have always felt that the Gen 5 sprites were the perfect middle ground between these two ideas. And honestly, it's a shame we didn't get more games featuring them. It's just a stylized way to represent these Pokemon, and it seems a lot more timeless than the 3D models. They don't suffer from the visual quality of whatever hardware they're on. Of course, the shift to 3D Pokemon was inevitable. The heavy focus of the 3D element of Nintendo's next DS did not help, but also it was kind of just the most logical leap forward for the franchise.
In hindsight, this helped warm a lot of people up to the sprites, but make no mistake, people have wanted 3D Pokemon for a long time. I can't imagine the feedback of having a Pokemon game on the 3DS still having Pokemon with predominantly 2D sprites. Back in Dragon Spiral Tower, and this task that was finding Reshiram, it seemed to me to possess the heart and skill necessary to awaken and control them, allowing us to have a showdown between truth and ideals. And he's not had the same conviction as he once did about his mission. He's almost exclusively focused on it, sure, but our repeated encounters with him have proven that we work alongside him, allowing us to beat him every time. It says these things not in a way that implies he thinks it can't be stopped, but more as a genuine test of his strong. It seems as though if the player were to stop it, he would genuinely be okay with that, since we prove that maybe the world he sees isn't necessary. And he's a very unorthodox antagonist. Calling him a villain would definitely be an inaccurate statement. We all meet back outside the entrance to the tower, where Alder tells us he suspects Reshiram might be at the Relic Castle, which means we finally have to go back and visit him. We meet Olin learns to fly for some reason. We also see Charon recognize that strength is not just strategic dominance, but the ability to stand up where necessary, and that his Pokemon might help him to achieve that strength. You can only make a Desert Ruin so interesting. I always loved the concept of it, a mysterious ancient place with rich history that we can only hope to catch glimpses of the past in. But there's still only so much you can do before they become visually repetitive. Puzzles been incomplete for a long time, and we can only hope to guess at some of the shapes of their pieces. Unfortunately, we don't really spend enough time here to ever instill that sense of wonder into them. This area is never really the focus. Sure, we have to come here, but it's not like it was hidden that we didn't know about it. Our focus at this moment is finding Reshiram. This is more or less the backdrop for doing so. My real gripe with the Relic Castle comes in the form of these sand pit puzzles. I can say puzzles, but that's not really a fair assessment. It's just a trial and error. This is effectively a teleporter, something Pokemon is notorious for. Unless you look up a guide online to tell you which ones lead you down the path of least resistance, you're kind of just hoping you pick the right ones. Oh, and this is also another Team Plasma dungeon, so there are a ton of battles here too. What is cool is that you can actually walk through these vortexes, but you can't run through them without being sucked up. It does at least make them a little more interesting than just being teleporters, I suppose. For as long as we spend here, I don't really have too much to say about it. It's a place I like more in concept than in practice, but I don't necessarily have anything against it. This place will actually get more interesting later, but right now we don't have access to all the areas of the castle. We do this entire dungeon forgets us to tell us that the Lightstone isn't here, which, I mean, of course it isn't. We've seen it already. Getsus also invites us to resurrect Reshiram to challenge him. But unlike him, he seems far more focused on the fact that Ant can triumph regardless. He needs it. He has to, but he still tries to phrase it as though he wants us to challenge him, that they both share this view. During our conversation, he also reveals that Alder's former partner Pokemon actually died, and that he left the Pokemon League in the care of the Elite Four while he wanders the region. Surprise, surprise, the Lightstone in Nacrene City was actually the legendary Pokemon Reshiram. I actually do think it's neat that we have a check on Stone within a Pokemon game. Usually the legendary gets brought up throughout the game, and we don't really encounter it until the climax. I mean, of course, we don't actually encounter Reshiram until then, but it's still a neat little reveal. And the Lightstone does have its own music, because having the normal Get Item music would 100% undercut this moment, so thanks for that. Of course, everyone immediately realizes that we don't actually know how to draw Reshiram out of the stone, which means that if push comes to shove, I will have to confront N without it. The next step in the plan is for me to take on the Pokemon League so I can catch up to N and Alder, which kind of just means we're back to our gym challenge, because there's no other way to do the Pokemon. I do think it's funny given the stakes that I've been granted the stone form of one of the two legendary dragons and will be expected to defeat him, but if I want to get to him, I still have to go through the Pokemon League like everyone else. I feel like the circumstances are dire enough that this might not be the best idea, but we do need to go to Opelucid City anyways, because hopefully Drayden can tell us something about how to revive Reshiram. Opelucid City puts the whole black and white theme on full display. However, it is not the most obvious example of this, funnily enough. The city has a different look depending on which game you're playing. White's Opelucid City is very much a relic of the past. All the houses appear to be built from stone bricks, a lot more like a historical site. Black's Opelucid City is far more futuristic, even by Pokemon standards. Coated entirely in neon, even the walkways pulse with glowing circuitry. The one exception is the Pokemon Gym, which is the same in both games. In Black, the gym's been sectioned off, and it's a historical landmark they're trying to deter people from touching. Instead, you just have Pokemon battles inside it. The inside, contrasting the exterior, is far more futuristic. The gym actually strikes a balance between the two games in this one. I want to take a minute to talk about the dragon typing in this game. So starting in Gen 6, it'll get a major change. I don't think it's much of a secret that the dragon type was quite powerful before the addition of the fairy typing. That's kind of the whole point of adding the type. Dragon only has two weaknesses in this game. Dragon and Ice. Ice is... well, the Ice type has its own set of problems it has to deal with. Dragon may hit only other Dragon-type Pokemon with effective damage, but it's only resisted by Steel, meaning most Pokemon just kinda have to take it. Dragon Pokemon are pretty notorious for their high base stat totals. The heavy focus on Dragon types in this generation definitely showcases how they don't really have enough checks, especially considering Dragon Pokemon are often fan favorites. They definitely weren't about to get weaker stat-wise either. Pokemon always has at least one pseudo-legendary Pokemon per generation. These Pokemon are Stage 3 ones that are somewhat difficult to obtain and always have a base stat total of exactly 600. Of the 10 pseudo-legendary Pokemon, 8 of them have been dragons up to this point. After Team Plasma's speech, Drayden tells us about how Reshiram and Zekrom were once one Pokemon who helped to set up twin heroes until their difference caused a rift between the two. The original dragon then splits, and the two siblings fought until they learned that Reshiram and Zekrom were equals, and they could not best one another. Iris mentions how this conflict was later resumed by their children, resulting in the destruction of Unova. More importantly, they don't know how to reawaken the Lightstone. The cyclical nature of this conflict is, of course, about to come to a head again. N pursues his ideals as we attempt to show him the truth. Iris and Drayden don't really acknowledge this bit of information, but it does raise the question of what happens when we face off with these Pokemon. The last time they confronted one another, it destroyed the entire region, and facing N seemingly involves doing the exact same thing again. Of course, the region will not be destroyed by our conflict, which I think begs the question, why? If these Pokemon are so deadlocked that they destroyed everything around them in their conflict, what makes this moment different? Of course, the real answer is, we have to win. That's how the game works. Pokemon doesn't really deal much in neutral endings, especially not at this point in time. If we lose the battle versus N, then we simply return to the Pokemon Center and heal up to confront him again. But I would like to pitch an alternate theory later, and later is rapidly approaching. Opelousas City is also the home to the only repeatable triple or rotation battle in the entire game, which you can take on once a day. This feels like such a mediocre solution to the problem, both in getting people into these battles and in keeping their interest. You can't even find triple battles in the battle subway, the post-game battle tower of sorts. Our only task left in the city is taking on the gym. For as many new Pokemon as this generation brings, this gym painfully points out how few dragon types there are in this game. I mean, this gym is not the only one, though, as Icarus City Gym suffers from the same problem. There are others a little less noticeable given that your Pokemon selection at the lower levels is a lot smaller than it is at the end of the game. While it does make for a little less variety, this is of course because Black and White feature only new Pokemon until you've completed the main story. So while it doesn't make Icarus and Opelousas City gyms less repetitive, I do like this decision overall, and intend on talking more about it once we beat the game. Beating Drayden and his Haxorus isn't so bad when you have an ice cream cone this strong, and now that we have all the badges, we're officially in the home stretch. No sooner do we start walking along Route 10 before encountering Bianca and Charon, the latter of whom challenges us to a battle. This one's a little different, however. We've seen Charon focus on getting stronger for the entire game, but he's not challenging us to prove that he's stronger. Quite the contrary, actually. Charon wants us to prove that we're strong enough to face off against the Elite Four, against Anne. This is pretty impressive character growth from Charon, and I think it speaks a lot to Alder's words and how they've affected him. There is purpose in strength, and here that purpose is challenging N and his ideas, being the truth of the relationship between people and Pokemon, with or without Reshiram. Approaching the badge gate now requires us to look back at the challenges we've overcome. I really like how each area is modeled after the type that the gym leader used. The first one even incorporates fire, water, and grass, which is pretty neat. This is probably my favorite version of checking your badges, because instead of having one NPC look through all of them and saying, yep, you cross each gate one by one and feel the distinction between them all. I only wish that they could reflect more of each leader's personality. My favorite by far is the wind tunnel one, mostly because your character floats up and down when you stand in it. We get one last look at a pair of dueling dragons, a vision of what's to come before we're placed at the foot of Victory Road. Victory Road is a staple of the Pokemon franchise, and honestly, they're kind of a pain in my ass. It's one final big dungeon, a test of your endurance and skills as a trainer.
and a lot of the time they're just big mazes and caves that you have to find your way out of. This one's not different per se, but it does have another gimmick at play at least. These slanted walls can actually be slid down. You can't climb up them, sure, but you can descend down the side of the mountain and will have to do so in order to progress. Oftentimes you can't even see the bottom, and the game makes no indicator as to where exactly you have to fall in order to keep moving forward. And where you slide does matter too. Go too far to the right and you'll slide all the way to the bottom. While this victory road makes no attempt to take any of the guesswork out of trying to reach the exit, at least it has the decency to do so in a new manner. There's not really much else to add. I mean, you can encounter Terrakion here if you wanted to add him to your team before the Elite Four. I like that you can do this with all the Swords of Justice before you complete the game. All you need to do is find Cobalion first. You only need Surf and Strength, but you can use those after completing Miss Stratton's gym. It's always more impactful when you can bring these Pokemon along during the main quest, because that's when people spend the most time playing the game. Of course, the problem with this is that legendary Pokemon tend to be stronger than normal ones, and as such can make portions of the game easier. But let's not act like Pokemon is always a challenging franchise. I mean, I beat Y in like a day and a half, and that was on release. The worst part is I don't even think that's impressive. It's probably pretty normal. But we're not here to talk about Gen 6. I mean, maybe if enough people enjoy this video. We're here to talk about the Pokemon League. For a region that's largely based on the US, the Pokemon League is very ornate and royal. Everything is golden, and while I like the look of it in a vacuum, it does stand out to me given that a lot of cities in this game feel very grounded in reality, with the exception of Opelousas City, no matter which version we're talking about. There's not really a lot of technology at play here either, which is strange for a Pokemon game. Upon entering the official challenge, you come face to face with a statue and 4 doorways. For the first time, you can actually choose the order in which you want to fight the Elite Four members. I also find it interesting that this Elite Four follows a rock, paper, scissors style type matchup. Ghost, Psychic, Fighting, and Dark. It's not as simple as the traditional Fire, Water, Grass trio, sure, but each member hits at least one other member for super effective damage. Wyrmsley just gets to double dip and Chantal gets to be immune to Marshall. Once you've beaten everyone, you can activate the statue to descend to the champion and take him on. I do love how elaborate each of these rooms is. Every game tries to theme the rooms to match the member, but Gen 5 really takes this above and beyond. Not only are these rooms pretty big, but each one has its own ascent animation and theming. The whole thing is way more elaborate than it needs to be, and I can at least admire that. If you're willing to go big, you might as well go all the way. Now, normally the characters you challenge in the Elite Four are people you've not really encountered in the story before, but there is one exception to that rule here. If you played Heart Gold, Soul Silver, or Platinum, you might recognize Caitlin as the lady from the Battle Castle in the Battlefront here. These games don't really make much mention of her earlier appearance, but we've seen her before, and it's interesting to see how much she's changed since then. The battle music here is probably my second favorite track in the entire game, maybe in any Pokemon game. The energy is just incredibly infectious, and it's hard not to feel pumped up to take everyone on. The heartbeat rhythm really reflects the mood that we're up against. The energy's there, sure, but there's a looming threat that we know has to be stopped. The Elite Four follows the same formula as it always has, except notably they do not get more difficult with each one defeated, since you can take them on in any order. This does technically make them a little easier to beat, but because they have Pokemon that have powerful types, I think it's a pretty negligible difference. Sorry, Aaron. Entering the champion's room, we come to the realization that we will not be facing off against Older, as he stands there defeated, bested at the hands of N. This isn't exactly much of a shock, given that this is a Pokemon game and we, the protagonists, have not yet beaten the evil team. N then turns his focus to us, realizing that we have found Reshiram, and decides that the Pokemon League is not the place to have our legendary showdown, and issues an order that I genuinely did not see coming the first time playing this game. the Team Plasma Castle to rise up around the Pokemon League. This is far and away my favorite moment in any Pokemon game. The realization that Team Plasma has been living under the nose of the most powerful trainers in the region for who knows how long. Keeping something this massive a total secret, it almost reads like an indictment of the Pokemon League. They could be so clueless as to let something like this live right beneath them. Watching the castle shoot up from the ground and connect to the League gives us a sense of scale on just how massive this place is. How it isn't kidding when he says this place is more fitting for the confrontation we're about to have. I have a deep fascination with places in video games that you're only allowed to visit once, and I think a lot of that intrigue stems from N's Castle. Not only does this place look amazing, if you thought the Pokemon League looked outdated, this place is on a whole other level, with its deep blue pattern tiles and walls that appear to be gilded. Knowing that you won't be allowed to return heavily incentivizes you to explore as much as possible in order to learn everything you can, as well as find all the items that this place has to offer, which admittedly is not that many. This is our best chance to learn anything about him, because he's not really going to talk about himself much on his own. Entering the castle brings us face to face with 6 of Team Plasma's 7 sages, who are none too interesting in honoring N's desire for a battle to decide the fate of Unova, telling us that we might ruin Gets' perfect plan. By this point, it should be obvious who's really in charge of Team Plasma, as the loyalty of the sages does not lie with their king, but the guy who seems pretty unabashedly evil at this point. Just when it seems like we might be outnumbered by the 7 sages, Unova's gym leaders show up to back us up. It's a pretty nice moment to show us why these people are Unova's leaders in the first place, though it does strike me as a little weird that the Elite Four isn't present during this encounter. Given the 2D sprites, there's only so much energy that can be conveyed in this moment, but the Pokemon Generation series does a pretty good job of animating this moment. Venturing up the floors, we encounter N's room, which is definitely not how I pictured something of that nature when I first got here. I think I imagined something more inviting to Pokemon, a lot more natural than this, childlike. In spite of that, this room is very indicative of how I expect Getsus to treat him. His room is filled with toys to keep him entertained, keep him distracted. Getsus has spent a long time sheltering him, but it's not out of any desire to keep him safe, rather to keep him from interacting with people, to keep him as someone who understands Pokemon better than him, a trait which ultimately allows him to call upon Zekrom with the power of his ideas. This room also helps to give off the illusion that Getsus is a caring individual, when in reality his gifts are a facade, trying to mask the true nature of his intent. This isn't speculation on my part either. In this castle, there are 2 NPCs who we've never met, but are very familiar to us, as we see them every time we boot up the game. Anthea and Concordia are these sisters who were also adopted by Getsus, and Concordia corroborates much of the story, explaining that we grew up surrounded by Pokemon, specifically those who have been injured, all in an attempt to keep them pure, to convince them to pursue this goal, leading Getsus to Zekrom. Ascending to the final floor of the castle, we come face to face with Getsus once again, who still is encouraging us to challenge N, the strongest trainer in the region, still trying to sell us on his end. We're now allowed to enter the throne room and confront N, sitting on the far end, ready to face us. N notices that Reshiram has yet to awaken, concluding that it hasn't recognized us as the hero before telling us we can either face him in Zekrom or leave and admit defeat. As we come face to face with Zekrom's power, we realize that we might actually have to challenge N without the legendary Pokemon, or else let him take over unopposed. Except, of course not. This is a Pokemon game. This is the moment Reshiram finally chooses to awaken. The game had to let us have this fight. What would have been the point of talking about it the whole time and just not letting us use Reshiram to face off against him? We do now have to take a small detour to catch Reshiram, which is actually pretty easy because it has a catch rate of 45, or about 12%, which is pretty high for a legendary Pokemon, which normally sit at a catch rate of about 1.6%. This is due to the fact that you have to catch Reshiram here in order to continue the story, as in future games, Reshiram's catch rate is adjusted back down to 1.6%. In addition to catching Reshiram, you have to include it in your party for this fight. No matter who you end up swapping out, Reshiram will lead your team for this battle. I kind of gave the game a hard time by saying, of course we get to use Reshiram, this fight had to happen, but I do believe this is the most cinematic fight in Pokemon game. For the first time ever, your opponent isn't just someone evil, someone powerful, and believes in what he stands for, and we could argue that he's not entirely wrong in his premise. Not only that, but for the first time an NPC wields a box legendary against us in a battle. its final theme is my favorite song in the entire Pokemon franchise, bar none. Way back in the beginning, I talked about how the theme felt incomplete. While I was being a little facetious, I stand by that this version is much more complete. It keeps the core events theme while also noticeably raising the stakes of the moment. You could still use the original here, and it would work, but it's a lot less grand, and I think it would detract a little from the fight. One interesting thing that unfortunately I don't exactly show off in my gameplay here is that Zekrom will always lead with Fusion Bolt in an attempt to get you to use Fusion Flare. This is because the moves have additional effects when combined. One is used after the other. Its power will increase as well as play out a new animation. I didn't do this, unfortunately, despite knowing it, but thankfully Bulbapedia has a GIF of the animation that I can share with you, very kind of them. The rest of the battle is a pretty standard affair. Eventually, we defeat N's Pokemon and prove that his ideals are no match for our truth, and N must finally admit that what we say, or moreover what all the NPCs around us say because we don't ever talk, has some weight to it. It confronts the idea that maybe we both are right to a degree, that maybe things aren't so black and white. While N seems content to have been proven wrong, to have been defeated, Ghetsis is not. Chastising both me and N, he admits that all of this is a farce, an image that he projects to the masses, keeping them clueless to both Team Plasma's true goals, as well as their true leader. N is a pure and righteous figurehead, but he is not the leader of Team Plasma, really. Ghetsis is now forced to take matters into his own hands and tries to take its downfall and weaken, but N intervenes before the fight to heal our Pokemon through sad boy magic. Anyone who's played this game before will tell you that this fight against Ghetsis is no fucking joke. His team's pretty competent, but none of his Pokemon stand out as particularly weak. Electros has no weaknesses and can hit pretty hard. Cofagrigus is a defensive wall, but the thing that absolutely makes his team memorable is Hydreigon. Ghetsis has decided to bend the rules in his favor by having a Hydreigon at level 54, which is 10 levels lower than Hydreigon normally evolves. And this fight proves to us why Hydreigon evolves at the level it does. With a pretty even stat distribution, Hydreigon does nothing poorly. He's both fast and he hits hard, and there's no fairy type in this game to hit him for 4 times damage. I actually lost this fight to Ghetsis the first time I faced him while recording this playthrough. I don't even know how many times I've lost to him on previous ones. I actually knew someone who couldn't defeat Ghetsis when the game came out, and someone had to trade them a level 100 Beartic to try and do it. Only problem was even that wasn't enough to defeat Ghetsis on its own. If you end up watching this video, I'm sorry for putting you on blast. It's all for the narrative, I promise. The other interesting fact is that Hydreigon has at least one move that's super effective against each of N's Pokemon, no matter if he's wielding Zekrom or Reshiram. Ghetsis has always been prepared to take down N if he needed to. After defeating Ghetsis, the second time around, he finally has nowhere else to turn. The battle is truly over. Ghetsis can't seem to grasp how he's been defeated. Meanwhile, N is unsure of what to do now. Alder reminds him that just because we're different doesn't mean we can't come to an understanding. Our goals are different, but not necessarily unaligned. N then asks to talk to us. He tells us how in Spursha City he was shocked that our Pokemon actually liked us. After the years he spent in isolation, caring for Pokemon that had been wronged by people, having his worldview manipulated by Ghetsis, N found that Pokemon were not unhappy to work alongside people. He realized there might be some truth in what we said, and that's why he wanted to prove himself so badly. He wanted to prove that he was right. But here and now, he was finally forced to confront the idea that maybe he wasn't. N says he's not entirely sure if he understood Pokemon after all. He encourages us to chase our dreams, do what we feel is true, before departing on the back of Zekrom. Roll credits. No Pokemon game has ever impacted me in the same way this one has. To this day, the ending of the game still leaves me speechless. It still invokes the same feeling in me it always has. Normally, after completing the main story, you'd still have to go through the Elite Four and beat the champion. It's almost like a victory lap. But here, the climax takes place at the Pokemon League. There's nowhere left to go. You're forced to reckon with the events that just happened and the words that N meets us with. We'll talk about the flaws I see in this game in a minute, but this is the perfect ending to a Pokemon game, in my opinion. It leaves a lot in the air about what happens to N, to Ghetsis, to Team Plasma. We have a very deep conversation with N before he disappears from the game forever. We will not get a chance to encounter him again. N is my favorite Pokemon antagonist because he's not actually a villain. N makes a very valid point about the relationship between people and Pokemon, and the game doesn't really go out of its way to treat him like a villain either. Alder forgives him. He recognizes that N was manipulated in the same way the people of Unova were by Ghetsis. N actually had it a lot worse. He's endured years of this abuse, unaware it even was abuse, I suspect, all for the sake of someone who never truly loved him, who never even really saw him as a person. I love the way the game handles N, but I'd be lying if I said I love the way the game handles the story. Ghetsis is a menacing villain, don't get me wrong, but I kinda wish the game didn't have a true villain. I wish that our battle with N, the conflict of our worldviews, wasn't undercut by the fact that N has actually been manipulated the entire time. Most of the game is spent having different NPCs argue against N's choice to liberate Pokemon from people, but I wish the story would take him a little more seriously, because we do see people abusing Pokemon throughout not just this story, but many Pokemon games. Granted, the people doing the abusing in this game are Team Plasma, but the point is that N is not inherently wrong when he says that people tend to mistreat Pokemon, and the story doesn't ever really offer an alternative solution to this problem. N is defeated, he admits that we might be right, but I wish the story would go out of its way to acknowledge that he has a point, that there are lots of people out there who mistreat Pokemon. Imagine that the game does this, that we see the ways that people hurt Pokemon, the way the system has its flaws, how the world of Pokemon is not a perfect one, and then we have to confront N. We have to fight because there are plenty of Pokemon who have a symbiotic relationship with their trainers, Pokemon who don't want to be liberated, and we beat him. And he relents, and there's no grand reveal that the whole thing was rigged by an evil mastermind. And N goes off in search of what to do now. Did we really win? Is there a true victory in saving a system we already know is flawed? We've saved the Pokemon who were happy with their place among people, sure, but what about the ones that aren't? This level of discussion might be a bit too deep for a Pokemon game, but I've spent a long time running through this scenario, years before I ever even thought of creating this analysis. Maybe that was the catalyst for my writing this. Maybe that's why we're here. I don't want you to think that I don't like the game's story, because that's not true. I've just always wondered if it could be made better. I've always wished that it contained a real discussion about the ethics of Pokemon. It comes so close to touching on that idea, but at the last second it chickens out. Ghetsis comes in to prove that it was always about being evil, that no good was ever going to come from liberating people in Pokemon. And we don't talk about it again. In fairness, it's not like this reveal comes out of nowhere. I've spent all this time talking about how there's a lot of not-so-subtle foreshadowing to the reveal of Ghetsis. I will say that his manipulation is a pretty heavy topic for a Pokemon game, and one that we'll see return again with a much larger role in a future game, but that's a story for another time. The relationship between Ghetsis and N is something the game reveals to us, but doesn't really have the time to talk about. But I promise you we will talk about it, and I guess that's something good that does come from the ending of the story. I mentioned earlier about how the last time these two Pokemon fought, it wound up destroying everything. I said that I had a theory about why that may not have been the case this time, but didn't elaborate then. Now that we've heard the full story, I can finally talk about one of the many pins that I've put away for later. Throughout our encounters with N, we see his conviction about his ideals, how badly he wants to free Pokemon. But at the same time, we beat him at every opportunity. Our truth to him is that Pokemon don't necessarily want to be freed, and we all work best when we work together. This concept clearly makes N distraught. He admits as much when he reveals that when he first encountered us, our Pokemon told him he was happy. I think that this weakening of his conviction, coupled with the strength of ours, may mean that our Pokemon are not fighting on an equal level. Our pursuit of the truth is stronger than his desire for his ideal. At least, his ideal world of free Pokemon. No doubt that N will set himself a new goal to work towards, allowing his partnership with Zekrom to grow. Black and White is not just the names of these games, but the core theme of them as well. We see it in the two sides of Appaloosa City, nature versus technology, and us and N in truth and ideals. One of the more interesting and apparent representations is in the way that Zekrom and Reshiram are depicted. Black and White are unconventional in that the names of the games are not indicators as to which Pokemon is the focus. We just played through black in order to obtain the white Pokemon Reshiram, where in white we learned about Zekrom. This seems to me like a clear representation of yin and yang, a Taoist symbol about the concept of opposing forces working together to create balance. The story tells us that the two Pokemon were once one, working in harmony until they were split apart by the warring brothers. The cyclical nature of this conflict is also reflected in the depiction of the yin and yang symbol as a circle. Within darkness, there is light. Though Plasma's goals are ultimately revealed to be entirely selfish, in stands as the ray of light in Ghetsis' malicious plan. He only ever sought to do good and relinquished that his approach may not be correct when we defeat him. In light, there is darkness. Though we have saved those Pokemon who did not wish to be freed by Yin and Team Plasma, we have not inherently solved the problem that comes with capturing Pokemon with technology and keeping them. There are those who seek to use Pokemon maliciously, without regard for their well-being. Of course, as I said, the games don't really do enough with this idea other than just bringing it up. We have no potential solution to the problem, or even really an acknowledgement that it is a problem.
Make no mistake, I love these games. I do. I love that they bring a more serious set of themes to Pokemon. But they're definitely not subtle with that theming, and they're not always the best at conveying it. In spite of that, I think the games make a pretty good attempt to discuss these themes in a way that children could understand. I also love the 2D animated sprites. It's easily my favorite visual representation of Pokemon in any game. But I recognize that the shift to 3D was inevitable, and so I can't really be upset about that. I even like a lot of the designs that people hated when the game first came out. I remember when the game's released, many people were very critical of designs like Trubbish and Vanillish for being lazy copies of real-world items, an indicator of a lack of creativity. I would argue that there are lots of other fantastic designs in these games as well. Archeops is a pretty great take on dinosaur Pokemon, and all the dragons have interesting and distinct designs given how many different dragon Pokemon there had to be in this game. Zoroark is another fantastic design, and it's no wonder it became such a fan favorite for both its visual aspect and its game mechanics. I think Pokemon like Trubbish and Vanillish get an unfair reputation for being uncreative when there have been lackluster designs in every single Pokemon game, including Generation 1, which I remember being tantamount to sacred when Black and White first came out. Gen 1 has not one, but 3 different evolution lines who just evolved into more of the thing that they already were. Magneton is just 3 Magnemite. Trio is just 3 Diglett. Trio has one more head than Doduo. Muck is literally a pile sludge. I think in honing in on Pokemon like these ones, you're kind of trying to hand-wave all the other designs, and that's just not fair.
We may have completed the main story, but the game isn't quite over yet. No Pokemon game is complete without the post-game content. The Pokemon Black still has several places we've yet to visit, and a few special Pokemon we've yet to catch. With the increased presence of the internet over the years, Pokemon's in-game content has moved away from new areas to explore, and more towards online battles against other people. However, at the time, not all DSs were even Wi-Fi compatible, so this was not a major focus in these games. I personally don't recall ever playing against anyone back when the DS Wi-Fi service was still online. I think the most I ever did was boot up the GPS a few times to see if I could ever get the thing I needed, only to be met with people requesting impossible trades. It's always good to see that some things just never change. Moving up the game after completing the main story has us back in our room with Venom. It's a strong reminder of where we started this game, and how much has changed since then. Our Pokedex gets upgraded to the natural area, and we're now finally able to catch and receive Pokemon that originate from outside the region. Earlier, I touched briefly on how this was the first game since Generation 1 that you could only catch new Pokemon. Of course, Generation 1 has the distinction that there was no other way you could do anything else. I've always liked this about Generation 5, as it makes the game feel fresh even now. The one weird aspect about adding new generations of Pokemon is the way the franchise treats Pokemon like they were just kind of always there. Because each new game takes place in a setting that is established within the context of the world, the Pokemon that exist there are not brand new discoveries. This means that whenever a Pokemon game gets renamed, PDSP notwithstanding, it ends up retroactively including these Pokemon as a result. But because Black and White is only monthly Pokemon introduced in Gen 5, to beat the game at least, I feel like it manages to sidestep this problem to a degree, and helps make it feel less like they don't exist in this world. Bianca mentions to us that she's journeying to Black City, which which finally opens up the area to the right of Mombasa City for us. Black City is a neat-looking place, but may very well be home to what is kind of the weirdest mechanic in this entire game. Black City, or White Forest if you're playing Pokemon White, have varying populations. See, what the game hasn't told you is that it's secretly been timing you on how long it takes you to get there. The first time you arrive at this location determines your starting value for the city, with a minimum score of 20. This number determines the number of NPCs within the city, and which specific NPCs you can battle and encounter. You'll notice that in my playthrough, the value is so low that the market isn't even there. And that's one of the core parts of Black City, whereas in White Forest, Pokemon encounters are the core focus. The market sells a variety of items to us, but the items we have access to depend on who's in the city. Inversely, the Pokemon in the forest are also dependent on the same set of NPCs. Black City is all about battling trainers and buying items, where White Forest is all about catching Pokemon. I talked earlier about the biggest example of the game's dichotomy not being Opelousas City, and this is the place I was referring to. Black City is a place of greed and power. The game is not subtle about this by any means either. The price of items in the market is very high. I mean, a Pokeball costs you 10,000 Pokedollars. However, you can make $10,000 for every 10 trainers you defeat here, with a maximum of 10 trainers being able to appear in the city at a given time. The imbalance between these two locations is staggering to me. One of them lets you catch a bunch of Pokemon that are just not available to you otherwise, and the other lets you buy a Water Stone for $10,000. Even if you really liked battling, the Battle Subway provides a more challenging place to conduct battles in the late game. I suspect if you're going through the trouble of battling the trainers in Black City, it's most likely to keep the city at its maximum occupancy. Not to mention that the NPCs in White Forest can drop items around the place which you don't have to pay for, and the list of items you can find this way heavily overlaps with the list of items sold in Black City's market. Black City's one redeeming quality to me is that it's more visually interesting than White Forest. Black City is lined on all sides by a wall of dark skyscrapers, regardless of the size of the city. The fog that seems to loom over it, coupled with the slightly ominous music, gives the place a menacing energy that even something like Inn's Castle doesn't really have. By contrast, I find the music in White Forest to be much more forgettable. It certainly blends in with more of the soundtrack of the game than Black City's theme does. Honestly, Black City is the indictment of capitalism that I wish Castelia City was. Far fewer people will ever even get here, much less interact with the city enough to pick up on this theme. Half the player base of Gen 5 is immediately disqualified because they don't own Pokemon Black, which means that the only thing you have access to is White City, which is a nice place, but definitely does not tackle the same themes as Black City does. One thing you'll quickly notice is how every trainer now has Pokemon that are level 60 at about the lowest. By contrast, Getsus, the last NPC we fought before starting the postgame, had a level 54 Pokemon as its highest level 1, and the average Pokemon we face now is probably closer to 64. While this is not an unmanageable difference, it certainly feels like a sharp one considering my entire team is level 51. This does, at least, make every battle a little bit more of a puzzle, since now we have to work out the best way to take on this level difference without switching around too much or fainting too many Pokemon so we can actually gain experience in order to level up. I think this jump is honestly just more of a surprise than a hindrance, but there is a level of disjointedness I feel in defeating two people who are seen as the strongest trainers in the region. One of them is wielding a Pokemon most people only know from legend, and then these random trainers have Pokemon that are 10 levels higher. I don't know. Maybe I'm attributing too much significance to the level of canon in this game, because it's realistically more of a feature for the player to impress rather than an actual measurement of how well they the games. Until Town is the next place which actually has a decent amount to do, given how small it is. Tucked away in one of those houses is... Yep. Cynthia is here in Until Town, and you can battle her. Sinnoh Champion is just as intimidating as she normally is, while her Togekiss was great for Electros already. Additionally, fits in well, you got to use it for is still decidedly the same thing that she has in Generation 4. It's always fun to see characters from other regions roaming around places we wouldn't expect. It makes the world feel more connected, it makes these places feel less stealthy and pain. Cynthia isn't the one who appears in Caitlin's Book We can encounter Chantal and Caitlin during the spring, as well as the region's female gym leaders. This is another example of letting those leaders have characterization inside the gym. For Chantal and Caitlin, this is the only subject.
though Caleb does have her past, something that can't be said together. Cynthia also talks to us about Wonderful Bay, which is probably my favorite aspect of the post-game and one of the most intriguing areas of Pokemon. Given the target and breadth of Pokemon games, they often go out of their way to make sure you can understand what they're used to. Most puzzles in the game are visual, like straight puzzles with sliding recipes. Sometimes, though, the creators decide that they just don't want to give you any hints. In order to solve a puzzle, you're going to have to do some fucking research. The classic example is the Reggie trio from Pokemon Ruby Sapphire and Emerald. Up the way up on 134 is a secret spot where you're able to dive down. Hidden away here is a room called the Sealed Chamber, and in order to figure out what to do, you're going to use Braille to decode the message that you left in this habit. The closest the game comes to telling you this is tucked away in the game's manual. A note says that you might encounter these symbols, and if you do, they want you to know it's Braille. This message is also accompanied with a visual Braille alphabet. Black and White make no attempt to help you solve the mystery of the runes. Not yet, at least. Down here we can find a series of panels with symbols on them that we cannot decipher. In spite of this, we can technically solve the puzzle through sheer brute force, or more realistically, looking up at atoms. I don't really want to talk about this issue right now because these ciphers do technically hold the key to solving it, we just can't read them yet. The one thing we can talk about is all the items we can access on the first floor. Scattered throughout the labyrinth are elemental plates we can use to power down specialized types, as well as a series of relic items we can sell to an individual for a pretty high price. The ability of your Maniac is part of the series that contains to buy specific items for a very high price. Each Maniac specializes in something different, and the items they buy are largely unsellable to any price. No Pokemon is under the 5 years only the billionaire reports the riches that heading up towards Lucanos now, we can encounter the giant chasm. Speaking of the Lord, reveals to us that the monster there and the city built the wall for the humans around. I think if that's the case, they might have done this. Heading into the chasm, we encounter a main trees at the center of which is a small tunnel. As soon as we approach it, we hear the cry of a Pokemon before the whole place becomes covered in snow. This allows you to access the cave from the top right of the chasm. This is where we attack the Kira this time. It's a pretty well-established tradition at this point to introduce a legendary Pokemon to the complex, only to add that complex in a sequel game, unless your Generation 6. Many people expected the next game in the franchise to be Pokemon Ray, because the naming convention of Pokemon came up to this point, but before it set a pattern for the third game of the generation. Catching Kira does provide us with a little context for Ray's perfect execution. It generates a powerful freeze inside of it. Its body became frozen, the energy was dead. This spells out very clearly that Kira is the remnant of the original legendary dragon, the stories we've been told throughout the game. Instead of completely splitting the Pokemon in two, the shell of the original has remained in the form of Kira, fragmented in power he once held. This is even reflected in his base stat level, which is 660 compared to Zekrom, which is 680. Kira does not have a true equal to the other legendary dragons. It's not weak, he's definitely not comparable to the other two. The last place we haven't visited in all this time is Village Bridge, which, while pretty interesting to look at, and a pretty neat design for the town, has very little on in the way of things to do. There's a few different musicians you can find scattered around the place to provide accompaniment for the patient music. At least there is something here to incentivize you to return other than just to admire the work that's put into this place. It's probably the most interesting design for a town in the entire region, and it's not even really a town. You can't fly into the Pokemon. Even Black 2, White 2, there are only a couple of additions, but nothing to do on the reason for these visitors. So if you've been paying attention, and you better wake up. There's no sleeping allowed in this video. I'm just kidding, feel free to go back to sleep. But if you've been paying attention, you'll probably notice this thing on the bottom of the screen what would be the DS. I have successfully managed to go all this time without ever talking about the Sea Gear. I figured that if I'm going to talk about the whole game, I should probably bring it up eventually. Much like the Poketch before it, the Sea Gear occupies the bottom screen of the DS whenever we aren't battling. Unlike the Poketch, the focus of this device is on communicating with other players. The cartridge for this game uses much like hardware and Soul Silver. been able to use IR to initiate trades and battles without having to travel to Pokemon Center. GameSync allows you to put your Pokemon to sleep by sending it to the Dream Room. This ability worked through Gen 5's global link, and also allowed you to download various skins for your Seeker and have other uses. Of course, in 2014, Nintendo shut down the Wi-Fi services for the DS, meaning you cannot access this feature. I don't even think you can fulfill the DNS exploit to get this feature out. The DNS exploit basically allowed you to set the game's IP in order to still download and receive events, despite the fact that Wi-Fi services are not available. One of my favorite features of this thing, though, is the intro link. Intro link lets you communicate with games with other players, completing missions or even passwords, which allow you to acquire different bonus effects for a period of time, such as increasing the speed of egg pass, getting a discount from Pokemon, or even increasing the amount of shiny Pokemon. The Interlink's real function is allowing you to join another player's world, effectively giving the game a very small and unconstrained multiplayer. To say I was obsessed with this as a kid would be a pretty fair assessment, honestly. Sure, Pokemon has a true multiplayer now. This game came out like a decade ago, and this was the best we had for a long, long time. Sure, you're heavily limited where you can go with Pokemon, you can't have buildings, but none of that matters because my friends and I can play hide and seek with Pokemon. That alone will get you. In fact, for as much as I used it, I'm not sure how many missions I ever completed. The sad part is they removed this ability from Black 2 and White 2. You can't join another player's world using intro. I suspect this is due to all the visual changes in the new locations. You couldn't just update the software of old Pokemon games as you can today. Pokemon Black is my favorite game. The reason that I've been so critical of the story is because I feel like it has so much potential. And is such a compelling character that I just don't think gets explored as much as he deserves. And the story is so close to being amazing that you just commit to what it's going to be. I'm aware that nostalgia is a driving factor in why I like the story so much. But I also feel that many 3D games did. The 2.5D visuals of the DS era have aged far better than some of the X and Y. The problem we run into with 3D models is that while they have the ability to look a lot better, they also, machines still look a lot worse too. People Mercies still show some of the visuals in those games, especially in trees. It's easier to expose the flaws in something like that compared to the pixelated sprites and 3D models of these games. Now they're using the designs of Pokemon. I think the most valid discussion we can have would be with big sprites, but honestly, a lot of those were thought of Gen 1 corrected pretty much. After the release of Pokemon Black and White, everyone expected the next game to be great. To be fair, I think the developers set out to visually create something. In an old Pokemon.com interview with Junichi Masuda and Takeo Masuda talks about the development cycle of Pokemon Black and White 2, saying that, quote, in terms of Pokemon Black version 2 and Pokemon White version 2, it was actually near the end of the development of the first game when we started talking about what we wanted to do next. Maybe it was only 3 or 4 months before the actual release of Pokemon Black version and Pokemon White version came. He goes on to say that the reasoning behind this was because during internal testing, many people expressed interest in characters like Ian and Gentis, and the team decided that it would not only be a different challenge to do a sequel, but that they had enough to write about and they could expand upon the story they wanted to tell. I agree that after completing the story, these games feel pretty open-ended. We don't know anything about what Ian plans to do moving forward. I mean, that alone makes me interested in the sequel to these games. We also learned that Gentis is an escape from the Shadow Triad, laying up the groundwork as we turn to the antagonist moving forward. So the original plan for this video was that this would be the jumping point into Black 2 and White 2. But here's the thing. This took me like a year to do, and I would like to get some part of it out there. So we are going to press pause and talk about Black 2 White 2 another day. I apologize, but also I really just...
A young adult man, out of shape, living in his mother's basement, eating junk food, playing video games, and has lost his family. For a long time, this has been commonly in popular culture. What self-respecting 30-year-old would have such a life? It's obviously a reason he doesn't try enough, so we can laugh at this character to make ourselves feel better. 25 years ago, this situation seems unbelievable. Not to say that, this film in the year 2000 is from a show called Little Life, and features the main character, Chris Peterson.
That's precisely as I am. You're 30 years old. You still live with your parents. You're losing your hair. And you're stupid.
Now this doesn't exactly read the same in the 2020s. It's very common today to have men in their late 20s and early 30s who become married. In fact, in the US, 55% of 18 to 30-year-old men still live unmarried. In Australia, that number's around 54%. Something that people joke to us on TV 25 years ago is basically the norm today for men. We're better in this department, with less of them, but also we're doing better in education. In recent years, this issue has taken the limelight and it's got a lot of people asking why are young men falling behind.
It wasn't so long ago that men enjoyed a clear advantage in American society. But these days, different stories emerging. Men and boys fall behind.
Boys are not simply falling behind. They're falling behind in absolute terms from their prior generations of boys.
If a group is falling behind in society, we don't tell them to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. We spend billions of money in taxpayer-funded charities, think tanks, to try and work out what's going on, to try and bring them along for the ride. That's not happening with them.
They don't have a stable job, a wife, a white picket fence, or little loved ones right around the house. They often try to follow their parents' way of life, but it just doesn't work. It seems, somewhere along the way, they get stuck. They think to themselves, I chose, I'm lazy, but is it really their fault, or is it a failing system?
It's now clear that there are many boys and men who fall behind. And that we have to be able to think about gender inequality both directions. What makes that hard is that the changes have been so quick, so rapid, that it's hard to update our beliefs to match the new facts. It's a bit like the needle from a compass swinging round, suddenly north and south with north. It's really quite disorienting. But it's clear that some men believe now men are lagging quite a way behind, not least from college. That reflects that the boys are training girls throughout the education. 2/3 of the top academic performance in high school, measured by GPA, are girls. And 2/3 of those at the bottom are boys. It's not just in the US. If you look at the 20 most economically advanced countries in the world, there's on average a 13 percentage point gap in the share of young men and young women with a college degree, young women touch their life on a college degree. And in some nations, the gap is much bigger.
Just last year, a Wall Street Journal article titled, America's Young Men Are Falling Even Further Behind, journalist Rachel Wolf decided to follow a family of 6, the Morenos, all in all a normal family. The thing was, while their only daughter recently graduated from business school and got engaged, her 3 brothers, well into adulthood, are still living with their parents in their childhood bedrooms. When the father was asked about the situation, he stated, quote, "Something is amiss here. We love them. We love having them around. But that's not how you build your life." End quote. When they asked one of the sons, Daniel, if he shared this concern, he said, quote, "I just felt so lost. Nothing is really stopping me. It's just myself standing in my own way." End quote. For Daniel, a lot of this had to do with COVID. A loss of connection with his friends led him to drop out of school and become aimless. A study in 2021 by the Survey Center on American Life found that only 26%